What is iodine and why is it important for good health? How can you make sure you get enough? And what foods are a source of iodine and which are the best sources? I will be answering all this and more for you today. Iodine is a bit of a forgotten nutrient. It doesn't really get the attention that, say, protein or iron do. But actually, it's really critical for us to be healthy. So in this video, I'm going to cut through all of the noise and bring you a complete evidence-based guide to getting all the iodine you need to be healthy. And given the consequences of not getting enough iodine, I think this is material that you will be glad you've listened to, friend. I certainly learned a lot whilst researching this video that made me take iodine a lot more seriously. So with that said, let's dive right in. I'm Dr. Ryan Williams, your host and the founder of Growing Pure, where I help you make vegan cooking and health fast, simple, and mind-blowingly tasty. So it makes sense to ask first, what actually is iodine? Well, it's an element. If you go back to your school chemistry books and look at the periodic table, you will see it there. But it's also a mineral, which means it's found naturally in the Earth's soil and rocks and water. Beyond that though, iodine is a nutrient that we do need to eat or drink to be in good health. So how does the body use iodine? Well, it's used by a gland called the thyroid. And this is a small gland just here in the front of the neck. And the primary purpose of the thyroid gland is to produce two important hormones. These hormones are called thyroxine, also called T4, and triiodothyronine, also called T3. I'm going to call them T4 and T3 for brevity in this video. So what do T3 and T4 actually do? Well, they're critical for regulating our metabolism. They help to convert energy from the food that we eat into energy that our body can use to help our cells function and grow. And so in that role, these hormones are really vital for energy production, heart function, mood regulation, digestive health, and temperature control. So what I want to impress upon you here is that T3 and T4 are really important for our health, and we cannot make enough of them without iodine. And it turns out iodine may have other physiological roles in the body as well. It seems to have a role in our immune response, and also has a beneficial effect on breast tissue, in particular with conditions like fibrocystic breast disease, where cysts can form in the breast tissue. So this brings us on to the question, what happens if you don't get enough iodine, or conversely, you get too much? So when the thyroid doesn't produce enough T3 or T4, we can develop a condition called hypothyroidism, or underactive thyroid. And this is actually the most common type of thyroid disorder. Around about 11% of people in the US have it, so it's pretty common actually. We can also get a condition called hyperthyroidism, where the thyroid gland is producing too much T3 and T4, but this is less common than hypothyroidism. Now globally, hypothyroidism is generally caused by a diet that doesn't have enough iodine in it. Now, in countries like the US and the UK, this is less common because iodine deficiency is comparatively much rarer. In these countries, hypothyroidism is often caused by an autoimmune condition like Hashimoto's disease rather than iodine deficiency. However, when iodine deficiency does occur, it can be quite serious. So given that T3 and T4 help regulate our metabolism, that is sort of using energy to help our bodies function and grow, not having enough of these hormones can lead to difficulties with growth and development. And so this can be particularly dangerous in pregnant women or in infants, where we can get problems like miscarriage, stillbirth, stunted growth, or even cognitive impairment, sort of learning difficulties. So in adults, a severe iodine deficiency can cause what's called a goiter. This is sort of a lump or swelling in the neck as the thyroid gland swells up. And this can often accompany hypothyroidism when we're not getting enough of that T3 and T4. Other symptoms of hypothyroidism can be things like weight gain, dry skin and hair, constipation, feeling tired and fatigued, feeling cold a lot of the time. Now, I don't say this to scare you, but just to be honest about the reality of what can happen in severe cases when we're not getting enough iodine. So that brings us on to the next obvious question. Do people usually get enough iodine? Well, yes, but it's actually disconcertingly common that they don't. In the US, for instance, the median or the average iodine level is well within the healthy range, but it has dropped by more than 50% since the 1970s. And this is reflecting changing practices in the dairy industry over those years. More on that in a moment. And in the UK, the 2018 National Diet and Nutrition Survey found that 9% of children aged 4 to 10 and 14% of adults aged 19 to 64 were actually deficient in iodine. So that's actually quite a significant problem. And it does seem from the data that we have that vegans or those with a sort of non-conventional dietary approach do seem at greater risk of iodine deficiency. And I want to highlight one or two studies here that paint this picture. So a 2011 study out of Boston looked at the iodine sufficiency levels of vegans and vegetarians by analysing the concentration of iodine in their urine. And this serves as a pretty good proxy for iodine levels within the body. And they found that the median or the average vegan urine iodine concentration came in at around about 78 micrograms per litre, which is significantly less than the recommended level of 100 micrograms per litre. And for context, the general US population had a level of about 164 micrograms per litre, which falls within the healthy range. There was a really interesting additional takeaway here though, and this was that even though the vegans tended to have low iodine levels, this was not associated with thyroid dysfunction, which is quite surprising. And indeed, a 2020 journal article actually found that vegans have a 22% lower risk of hypothyroidism and a 51% lower risk of hyperthyroidism, in spite of this tendency towards less than ideal iodine levels. And this has been confirmed again more recently. A 2020 study out of Norway looked at vegans, vegetarians and pescatarians, their iodine levels. And they found that vegans had a level of just 43 micrograms per litre, vegetarians 67 micrograms per litre, and pescatarians 96 micrograms per litre. So all of these groups were actually lower than ideal, and the vegans were lowest of all. Now, it is somewhat reassuring that a plant-based diet does seem to be protective against thyroid disorders, which is, of course, the main concern when it comes to iodine deficiency. But nonetheless, being in an iodine deficient state is clearly a concern and can be quite dangerous, and it's something that we do want to address. And this is especially true when it comes to pregnancy and infancy. So this begs the question, why would it be that vegans are more at risk of iodine deficiency than the general population? Well, that brings us on to our next topic. Where can you get iodine through your diet? Now, I want to take you back for a little bit of a history lesson here, because in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was observed that certain populations living in the US in certain areas, in particular the Great Lakes and the Appalachians, these people suffered goiters, these sort of neck swellings, and iodine deficiency at a much greater rate than the population elsewhere in the US. So in response to this, beginning in the 1920s, many salt manufacturers have been intentionally fortifying their salt products with iodine to help make sure that people get enough. And generally, this has been a really successful public health measure. And still today, you can find iodized salt across much of the US and many other countries too. However, the iodization of salt is very inconsistent because it's entirely voluntary, right? So manufacturers are under no obligation to do it. And actually most of the salt in our diets comes from processed foods, and that salt is generally not iodized. Additionally, if you like specialty salts like sea salt or pink Himalayan salt, this is also not going to be iodized. And furthermore, outside of the US and Canada, salt iodization is much less common. For instance, where I live in the UK, Seeing iodized salt is very, very rare. We do see one or two other processed products, like especially bread, that can sometimes be fortified with iodine. But the other major source aside from salt in the diet is actually dairy products. So why would this be? Well, cows don't create iodine. Like I said at the beginning, it's a mineral. It's found in the earth and in the water, especially seawater. So that kind of begs the question, well, how does it end up in the dairy products? There are two major pathways here. The first one is that iodine is often added to a cow's feed as a supplement. And so that way the iodine works its way into the cow's milk, much the same way that iodine from a human mother's diet works its way into her milk, and that way it should be passed on to her offspring. The other major pathway for iodine to end up in milk and other dairy products is actually kind of an accident. Since back in the 1800s, iodine has actually been used as an antiseptic and a disinfectant because it has quite potent sort of bacteria-killing properties. Now, the udders of dairy cows are quite prone to infection. This is called mastitis. And so to try and prevent this, dairy farmers will often sort of dip the teats of the udders into an iodine-containing disinfectant. And so then, of course, when milking equipment is attached to the udders and milk is drawn out, some of that iodine from the disinfectant sort of leaches its way into the milk. And so that's another way that iodine can end up in the milk. Now, as you can imagine, this is very inconsistent because it's entirely at the farmer's discretion about what kind of disinfectants they use and what kind of feed they use. And so this is why we've seen such a dramatic drop in the iodine levels of the US population as dairy farming practices changed. So what about plant foods? If there's iodine in the soil, then surely some of it should end up in the plants that are grown in the soil. Well, yes, but there is a caveat. Unfortunately, the level of iodine in soils can vary quite considerably. Some soils are very rich in iodine and some are very poor in it. And in particular, we see soils in mountainous regions like the Appalachians, is usually quite low in iodine. And so it's hard to count on how much iodine you're getting from plant foods because it depends entirely where they were grown. And if you eat a lot of locally grown veg and fruits from an area where the iodine content in the soil is low, you're not going to be getting very much. Now, iodine is found in quite high levels in seawater. So many seafoods are quite a rich source of iodine. But as we saw with the Norwegian pescatarians, eating fish may still not be enough actually to get a sufficient iodine level. However, another seafood that does tend to have excellent levels of iodine is seaweed. This is generally very high in iodine, and even small amounts can provide all the iodine that you need. You might also find iodine in some fortified foods. So some food manufacturers will intentionally add iodine supplements to their products. And one place where you can see this is in plant-based milks. And this brings me on to a little bit of a story of my own here, because I worked for 3 years as a food scientist for an oat milk manufacturer. And I was responsible for creating the recipe for the oat milk. When I started, there was no iodine in the oat milk product that the company had, but I was keen to introduce it. One, as a bit of a competitive advantage, so because many plant milk manufacturers don't fortify with iodine, but also because I knew a little bit about this kind of stuff, right? I knew that we wanted to get more iodine into our diet. And so actually plant-based milks can be a really good source of iodine if they're fortified, which is very hit and miss. You would have to check the label. And finally, you could just take an iodine supplement. Now, these can be sort of minerals like potassium iodide, things like that, but some of the iodine supplements are literally just seaweed. And so that's pretty much all of the sources of iodine that you're likely to find in your diet. And perhaps this explains the low levels that we have seen in vegans. Vegans, of course, are not going to be eating any dairy or fish, and they're also potentially likely to avoid conventional salt. And so if they don't have much seaweed or supplements or fortified foods, it's easy to see how they could end up in an iodine deficient state. All right, so here is the million-dollar question. What are the best sources of iodine and how do you actually make sure that you get enough? Hey friend, I'm just going to jump in quickly here to offer you something. There's a lot of information in this video and I want it to be actionable for you in your life so that you can be healthy and thriving. That's why I've created a simple one-page summary of what I cover in this video. If it will be helpful to you, I'd like you to have it, totally free gift. Please click the link in the description and it is all yours. Now, back to the video. So ideally, we don't really want more salt in our diet, even if it is iodized. Why? Because a high level of salt raises our blood pressure and increases our risk for heart attacks and strokes. So this could probably be doing more harm than good. Well, what about dairy then? Well, again, this is likely to have negative net health consequences. Why? Well, milk and other dairy products are a major source of saturated fat in our diets, and this contributes to heart disease, to type 2 diabetes, and also to Alzheimer's disease. And studies have also linked dairy to an increased risk for cancers, in particular ovarian, prostate, and breast cancer. And this is also linked to the saturated fat and also potentially the hormones contained in dairy products. So I would suggest that these risks are not worth taking on just for the iodine that may or may not be in the dairy. And then, as we've said, just eating your veg is too inconsistent. You don't really know how much iodine is in the soil, unless you happen to know that all of your plants have been grown in an iodine-rich area. So what is my suggestion to you and what do I do? Well, firstly, it is worth pointing out that you don't need to eat iodine every day. So the thyroid actually stores a pool of iodine that it can draw from. So as long as you top up that pool every now and then with a good iodine source, you will be healthy. But on average, we want to be trying to eat around about 140, 150 micrograms per day. Now, as a general rule, food is much better for our health than supplements. I made a video about this. You can find it up here and linked in the description below. So if we can, we want to be getting our nutrients from food rather than supplements. So this leads me to suggest that the best source is actually seaweed. This is going to be reliable and you can get enough this way. So you might have some sushi, which has that nori seaweed wrapped around the outside, really delicious. Have some of that every now and then. Also, I quite often get some dried seaweed flakes and I sprinkle these on top of my food, a little bit like you would salt, but you can do it with seaweed. So this is a really good way for me to make sure that I'm getting some iodine on a pretty regular basis. You might also want to add sort of whole strips of seaweed to your soups or broths or something like that. Now, I would just offer one word of caution here. A particular type of seaweed called kelp, or it's also called kombu. This is extremely high in iodine, so much so that there is actually a risk of hyperthyroidism. You could get too much. So if you're going to use kelp or kombu, go easy on it. Don't use it all the time. Use it once in a while and not too much. Another good source is that if you do use plant-based milks, then choose an iodine fortified one. I use the iodine containing oat milk that I created whilst I was working for that company in my coffee and in my oatmeal on a pretty much daily basis. Now, if you hate the taste of seaweed or you can't get hold of any seaweed, although it is pretty easy, literally just go onto Amazon and type it in and you'll find a load, then I would suggest that a supplement is a better option than just chancing it and hoping for the best. If you do choose an iodine supplement, one containing up to 500 micrograms per day should be a safe level for you. And this also, quite importantly, applies for kids as well. So they need a reliable source of iodine in their diet just like adults do. So if you have a child, make sure they get either seaweed, a fortified food, or a supplement in their diet on a pretty regular basis. Now, for most people, I think this is a good strategy. However, if you are pregnant or you're breastfeeding, your iodine requirements are going to be higher because you have to supply yourself and a baby. So if you are even just planning to become pregnant, or certainly if you are pregnant, you do want to be careful about getting enough iodine because the fetus will use it for physical growth and for mental development. And as I've said, moderate to severe iodine deficiency in children can lead to stunted growth and a lower IQ. So this is not something you want to take a chance on. Now, breast milk does tend to contain iodine, but just like with dairy milk, this does depend entirely on the diet of the mother. So if you are breastfeeding, you really want to make sure that you're getting enough iodine in your diet, either through reliable seaweed or a supplement, I would suggest. Furthermore, if you're taking prenatal vitamins or your baby has formula, you want to check the label and make sure there is iodine in these. Please, because not all of them do. So you really want to make sure that you choose one that contains iodine. So there we have it, friend. I've been through a lot here, but this is because I want to give you the right information that will allow you to take care of your health and thrive. But I realize this is a lot to remember, and that's why I've created a simple one-page PDF summary of what I've covered in this video that you can take, have a quick reference of, and you will be able to get all the iodine you need to be healthy. So if that would be helpful to you, you can get it totally for free. It's my gift to you. Please click the link in the description below and it is all yours. Now friend, if you have enjoyed this video, then I think you will get a lot of value from my video on how to lower cholesterol naturally. This is a complete guide to lowering your risk for heart disease and living a long, healthy life by getting your cholesterol into the healthy range. If that sounds like it'll be helpful to you, you can click right here to watch that. I want to thank you so much for watching. I will see you again soon.